Tonight we begin with a diplomatic maneuver that Western intelligence officials had predicted, closely monitored, and strategically prepared for. A campaign that unfolded not over months of quiet maneuvering, but in a single dramatic week. A week that tested the foundations of the Western alliance. A week that exposed the Kremlin's desperation. A week that ultimately demonstrated something Vladimir Putin never wanted to see: the unshakable unity of nations committed to Ukraine's survival. What Putin attempted this week crossed a line that diplomatic tradition had long protected. And when that line was crossed, the United States, the United Kingdom, and Ukraine did not hesitate. They responded with coordination, with clarity, and with a unified message that echoed through every capital in Europe and beyond. Tonight, we examine how Putin's calculated attempt to fracture the Western alliance became the very catalyst that strengthened it. For several months now, there had been indicators, not formal intelligence assessments, not diplomatic cables, just indicators, that Vladimir Putin was preparing something divisive. Putin has been manipulative, yes, but he has been patient in his manipulation. His influence operations have followed a certain methodology, a predictability, almost a choreography that Western intelligence agencies had learned to recognize and anticipate. But what set off alarm bells in Washington and London this week was that the methodology shifted. Analysts who monitor Russian information warfare know the indicators. The sudden pivot in state media messaging, targeting specific Western audiences. The unusual diplomatic outreach to individual NATO members rather than the alliance as a whole. The strategic leaking of documents designed to create friction between allies. The coordinated deployment of social media campaigns emphasizing divisions. All of that accelerated dramatically. And whenever Putin accelerates his information operations, it means a strategic move is imminent. The approach was textbook divide and conquer. Russian diplomatic channels began emphasizing different messages to different audiences. To Washington, Moscow suggested that British support for Ukraine was reckless and endangered American interests. To London, Russian sources implied that American commitment was wavering and that the UK was being left exposed. To both, the message was clear: Ukraine is not worth the risk. Meanwhile, Kremlin-aligned media launched coordinated campaigns designed to amplify existing political tensions in both countries. In the United States, these campaigns targeted ongoing debates about foreign aid. In the United Kingdom, they exploited economic concerns about the cost of supporting Ukraine. The strategy was sophisticated. The timing was deliberate. And Putin clearly believed it would work. He was about to be proven spectacularly wrong. Early Wednesday morning, British intelligence detected what they described as an unprecedented coordinated influence operation, including the activation of dormant propaganda networks that had not been deployed in over 3 years. These are the kinds of information, warfare assets, that Russia only activates when they are signaling something very specific. An attempt to reshape political narratives in target countries, a major diplomatic offensive, or preparation for significant military escalation. Western analysts didn't know which category this fell into, or whether it fell into all three at once. But what they did know was that Putin was changing his strategy. And when an adversary shifts strategy this dramatically, without explanation, even by the smallest margin, every intelligence agency takes notice. The revelation came in stages. First, intercepted communications showed unusual coordination between Russian diplomatic missions and state media operations. Then, analysis of social media patterns revealed bot networks being activated simultaneously across multiple platforms in both the US and UK. Finally, diplomatic sources reported that Russian officials were making private overtures, suggesting that Western unity was already fracturing. The message Putin was trying to project was simple. The alliance supporting Ukraine is weaker than it appears, and smart nations should reconsider their positions before it collapses entirely. It was a calculated gamble, based on a fundamental misreading of Western resolve. But what Putin didn't anticipate was how quickly his strategy would be detected, and how decisively it would be countered. Within hours of intelligence agencies confirming the scope of the operation, secure communications began flowing between Washington, London, and Kyiv. The three capitals were about to demonstrate something Putin has consistently failed to understand. Shared values create bonds that Russian manipulation cannot break. The response, coordinated by Washington, London, and Kyiv, this week was not reactive. It was not improvised. It was not merely symbolic. It was strategic. Officials, after secure consultations, described Putin's gambit as transparent, predictable, and perhaps most importantly, counterproductive, the kind of operation that ultimately strengthens the very alliance it seeks to weaken. But divide and conquer only works if the targets can be divided. These three could not. In fact, the unified response this week was among the most coordinated demonstrations of Allied solidarity we've seen since this conflict began. Here's what we know. Within 48 hours of intelligence confirming Putin's strategy, the three nations announced a series of coordinated measures that sent an unmistakable message. These weren't the routine diplomatic statements we've become accustomed to. These were joint declarations, synchronized announcements, and coordinated military actions, the kinds of unified responses that democracies only deploy when they are determined to demonstrate unbreakable resolve. The United States announced an additional military aid package specifically designed to include capabilities that Ukraine had long requested. The announcement was made jointly with British officials, who simultaneously confirmed their own expanded support commitments. And President Zelensky, speaking from Kyiv, framed the announcements not as separate national decisions, but as a unified alliance response. The timing was deliberate. The coordination was meticulous. And the message to Moscow was unmistakable. Your strategy has failed. Tonight, White House officials confirmed that the coordinated response included new security commitments on multiple fronts, including advanced air defense systems that had been under discussion for months, but were now fast-tracked for what officials described as strategic signaling purposes. The three nations moved before Putin could claim any success from his influence campaign. They announced expanded military cooperation frameworks. They revealed new intelligence-sharing agreements. They confirmed joint training programs that will enhance Ukrainian capabilities for years to come. They unveiled economic support packages designed to ensure Ukraine's stability regardless of the conflict's duration. In other words, the alliance responded to Putin's attempt at division by deepening their integration. The infrastructure of cooperation that Putin sought to weaken has now been reinforced. This is what made the timing so significant. Putin's gambit wasn't just diplomatic theater, it was a strategic calculation. It represented the kind of influence operation that could have created genuine friction if left unchallenged. And the alliance, understanding that fully, responded with unity. Not defensively, not hesitantly, but proactively. They didn't allow Russian narratives to take hold. They didn't permit division to be manufactured. They demonstrated through action that their partnership is genuine. They showed that their commitment to Ukraine is unshakable. The British Foreign Secretary spoke directly to this point. Mr. Putin has spent decades attempting to divide democratic nations. Today, he has learned once again that we are stronger together than he imagines, and far more united than his intelligence services apparently report. And here's where the story becomes even more revealing. Intelligence analysts now believe that Putin's divide-and-conquer strategy was designed to exploit perceived weakness in the Western alliance after months of political uncertainty in Washington and economic pressures in Europe. Putin wanted to see whether American political divisions would translate into policy fractures. Putin wanted to see whether British economic concerns would override strategic commitments. Putin wanted to see whether Ukraine could be isolated from its most important partners. But instead, the opposite happened. Washington didn't waver in its support. London didn't distance itself from its commitments. And Ukraine remained at the center of a unified response that demonstrated the alliance's enduring strength. You don't often see Putin's strategies backfire this completely. But this week, they did. Senior diplomats speaking with NBC News under anonymity described Putin's miscalculation as strategic blindness, a fundamental misunderstanding of how democratic alliances function under pressure. Putin believed that political differences would translate into policy divisions. But democratic nations have shown repeatedly that they can disagree on domestic matters while remaining united on fundamental questions of security and values. The response this week proved that this alliance remains both cohesive and determined. Their coordination was not only rapid, it was comprehensive, covering military, economic, and diplomatic dimensions simultaneously. That comprehensiveness matters because it shows strategic depth. It shows that these three nations are not merely reacting to Russian moves. They are actively shaping the strategic environment. They are demonstrating that Putin's playbook has been read, understood, and countered. As announcements continued coming throughout the week, we learned more about the scale of the unified response. The United States announced expedited delivery of advanced air defense systems, forcing Russia to recalculate its air campaign planning. The United Kingdom confirmed expanded training programs for Ukrainian forces that had been under negotiation for months, but were now immediately approved. Ukraine, operating with enhanced intelligence support from both partners, launched precision strikes on Russian military infrastructure, demonstrating the practical benefits of the deepened cooperation. This wasn't just diplomatic signaling. This wasn't just rhetorical unity. This was operational coordination. This was strategic integration. And strategic integration is the one thing Putin has consistently sought to prevent since this conflict began. For every attempt Russia has made to create friction between Ukraine and its partners, the alliance has countered with something that deepens their cooperation. This week was the most dramatic example yet. While Putin was trying to manufacture division, the three nations were quietly finalizing agreements that will enhance their coordination for years to come. The contrast could not be more stark or more instructive. Remember, Putin thought American political polarization would eventually end support for Ukraine. He thought British economic pressures would create distance between London and Kyiv. He thought that if he could separate just one major partner from Ukraine, the entire alliance would begin to fracture. But tonight, the exact opposite is happening. American support is being renewed and expanded, with bipartisan voices emphasizing the strategic importance of standing with Ukraine. British commitment has been reaffirmed at the highest levels, with the Prime Minister personally emphasizing that the UK will stand with Ukraine for as long as it takes. And Ukraine itself has demonstrated that it remains a capable and valuable partner, worthy of the support it receives. The historical parallel that diplomats are increasingly drawing is to the early Cold War, a period when Soviet pressure actually accelerated Western integration rather than fragmenting it. Putin appears to be repeating the mistakes of his Soviet predecessors. External pressure is strengthening, not weakening, the bonds between democratic nations. What makes this moment so significant and so instructive is that Putin's divide-and-conquer strategy happened at a time when he is under extraordinary internal pressure. Russian military commanders want more resources for the grinding ground war that has consumed far more than anticipated. Russian nationalists want visible progress to justify the enormous sacrifices being demanded of the Russian people. Russian oligarchs want an end to sanctions that are progressively strangling their wealth and access to global markets. Russian security services want some return on the massive investments made in influence operations. Putin is balancing these demands while prosecuting a war that has become far more costly than he ever imagined. And when leaders in that position attempt strategic gambits, they're not doing it from strength. They're doing it from desperation. They're doing it from vulnerability. Putin's attempt to split the Western alliance was not the move of a confident leader. It was the move of a leader watching his strategic position erode and reaching for any tool that might reverse that erosion. But manipulation only works if the targets don't recognize what's happening. This week, Washington, London, and Kyiv demonstrated that they see Putin's strategies clearly and will not be manipulated. The joint statement released by Washington and London, now distributed through every major diplomatic channel, was designed to signal that the alliance is not willing to accept Russian manipulation as a legitimate tool of statecraft. Officials said plainly that Putin's influence operation was inconsistent with responsible international behavior and will only strengthen our resolve to support Ukraine. That is diplomatic language for, we see exactly what you're doing and it's not working. You don't usually hear that level of direct attribution from Western governments unless they want Moscow to know their operations have been completely compromised. Secretary of State Antony Blinken was characteristically measured but unmistakably clear. Russia's attempts to divide the democratic world will fail. Our partnership with Ukraine and with our British allies is built on shared values that no influence operation can undermine. British Foreign Secretary David Cameron was equally direct. Mr. Putin has invested enormous resources in trying to fracture the West. That investment has failed. We stand united with Ukraine today, and we will stand united with Ukraine tomorrow. The coordinated messaging left no room for misinterpretation. Meanwhile, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky addressed the Ukrainian people and the international community in what observers described as one of his most powerful speeches in months. He said, "Putin believed he could separate Ukraine from our friends. Today, our friends have shown that we stand together, not because it is convenient, but because it is right." He said, "Every attempt to divide us makes us stronger. Every manipulation makes our resolve clearer. Every lie makes the truth more powerful." And he said, "To the people of America and the United Kingdom, we see your commitment, we honor your partnership, and we will never forget what you have done for Ukraine." These are not rhetorical flourishes. These are statements from a wartime leader who understands that alliances are maintained not just through military support, but through visible, vocal solidarity. Zelensky's acknowledgement of his partners was itself strategic, a public demonstration of gratitude that reinforces the political case for continued support in both Washington and London. Here's what makes the situation even more significant. Putin's divide-and-conquer strategy wasn't an isolated effort. Along with the influence operations targeting the US and UK, Russian diplomatic channels also increased pressure on European Union members, attempting to exploit economic concerns about energy costs and refugee support. Russian state media launched coordinated campaigns suggesting that European unity was fragmenting. Russian intelligence services reportedly increased their recruitment efforts targeting disaffected political figures across the West. All of this happened within the same concentrated timeframe. When Putin moves multiple pieces simultaneously, it typically signals a major strategic initiative. But this week, that initiative was met not with the division Putin sought, but with unprecedented coordination. The alliance didn't just resist Russian manipulation. They used it as an opportunity to demonstrate their unity more visibly than ever before. Intelligence analysts are now considering several possibilities for Putin's next moves. One is that Putin will attempt to intensify his influence operations, doubling down on a failed strategy in hopes that persistence will eventually create fractures. Another is that Putin will shift focus to other potential pressure points, attempting to find weaknesses the alliance hasn't yet addressed. A third possibility, the one most concerning to Western officials, is that Putin will attempt to compensate for diplomatic failure with military escalation, using force to achieve what manipulation could not. But this week, the alliance demonstrated its readiness for any scenario. They didn't merely respond to Putin's current gambit. They didn't limit themselves to defensive messaging. They didn't wait to see if division would emerge. They proactively demonstrated unity in ways that make future manipulation attempts even less likely to succeed. The message to Putin was comprehensive. Your strategies are transparent, your operations are compromised, and your objectives will not be achieved. What we're watching now is a test of alliance resilience. Putin wants to prove that democratic partnerships are inherently fragile. The United States wants to demonstrate that American leadership in collective security remains reliable. The United Kingdom wants to show that Brexit has not diminished its commitment to European security. And Ukraine wants to prove that it is a worthy partner, one that democratic nations can trust with their support. These objectives are deeply interconnected. Success for one strengthens all. This week, all four objectives were advanced simultaneously. The alliance passed its test with distinction, and in doing so, sent a message that extends far beyond this particular moment. Tonight, we've heard from diplomatic sources who are monitoring the Kremlin's reaction to this week's events. They say Russian state media has gone notably quiet about the influence operation that was supposed to divide the West. They say Kremlin messaging has shifted away from claims of Western fragmentation toward other narratives. And they say Putin's decision to attempt such a transparent divide-and-conquer strategy is likely part of a broader pattern of miscalculation that has characterized Russian strategic thinking since the initial invasion. But the alliance is not resting on this success. In fact, all three partners are using this moment to deepen their coordination even further. Their response this week, swift, comprehensive, and remarkably unified, sent a message to Putin that manipulation will not work. And it sent a message to the world that democratic alliances, when tested, grow stronger rather than weaker. The practical implications are already visible. New military aid is flowing to Ukraine. New training programs are being established. New intelligence-sharing frameworks are being formalized. The infrastructure of cooperation that Putin sought to undermine has been reinforced and expanded. As this week concludes, we expect more details to emerge about the full scope of Russia's influence operation and the coordinated response it provoked. But what we already know is that the alliance's response was exemplary. It demonstrated that Western intelligence services can detect and attribute Russian operations rapidly. It proved that democratic governments can coordinate responses across multiple time zones and political systems. And it showed that the partnership supporting Ukraine is built on foundations that Russian manipulation cannot shake. What happens next will depend on whether Putin learns from this failure. If he scales back his manipulation efforts, this moment will be remembered as a turning point, the moment when divide and conquer finally, definitively failed. If he persists or escalates, the alliance has already demonstrated that it is prepared. They have shown they are ready to respond. They have shown that unity is not merely rhetorical, it is operational. And tonight, for the first time in months, Vladimir Putin appears to be genuinely uncertain. The Kremlin is quiet about this week's events. Too quiet. And when Putin is quiet, it means he is reassessing. It means he is recalculating his options. Because this week, Putin learned something he has apparently failed to understand despite years of evidence. Democratic alliances are not as fragile as he believes. Shared values create bonds that manipulation cannot break. And when threatened, free nations stand together. This story is far from over. But tonight, one thing is absolutely clear. Putin tried to split the United States and the United Kingdom from Ukraine. All three responded with unity that exceeded even optimistic expectations. And the alliance supporting Ukraine is stronger tonight than it was before Putin's failed gambit began. And we will be here, watching every development as this remarkable demonstration of democratic solidarity continues to unfold.